Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar on neurodiversity in the workplace, legal considerations and business strategies. I'm Teresa Sprain. I'm a shareholder in our labor and employment group in our Raleigh office.
Hi, I'm Erin Pelletieri-Hauser. I am a shareholder in the Labor and Employment Group, and I'm located in New Orleans, Louisiana. So a couple of housekeeping notes. As hopefully you'll see, there is a Q&A box for you to submit any questions. We've received some questions in advance, and we've incorporated those into the presentation. If you have a question, please pop it in there. We've got a lot of participants signed up today, which is great. And so we are going to do our very best to take those questions as they come. If we're not able to get to your specific question, we will obviously follow up with you after the fact. A PDF of the presentation will be available in the resource list and will be emailed to all of you in the coming days. And you will also be prompted to take a survey at the end of the webinar. Please let us know how we can do better, things you like, things you might like to see in the future. We really want to ensure that our programming is impactful and is helpful to you all in your business. You will be required and asked to click on pop-ups during the presentation in order to receive CLE credit. If something happens, you have a technical issue, please reach out to us, and we'll work with you to ensure that you get the credit for sitting through this presentation. All right, I'm going to move and turn this over to Teresa to tell us a little bit about neurodiversity.
Erin, thanks so much. I'm going to start by talking about what is neurodivergence and what is neurodiversity. What are the types of things that we're going to be talking about? It's a newer term. It was first used in the 1990s. And what it really just means is differences in the way the brain operates. If you go out and look for definitions, you will find many different ones that describe neurodivergence or neurodiversity. And we just use two examples here, one from Cleveland Clinic that talks about brains developing or working differently for some reason. The Stanford School of Medicine definition incorporates behavioral traits with those differences in brain function, and we'll be talking about some of that as well. This should be viewed not as a binary black and white analysis. People are neurotypical or neurodiverse, but there is a spectrum of neurodiversity, and so we should be thinking about it through that lens. I want to say at the outset, and we'll reiterate this as we go through, we're not here to talk about how experienced we are in diagnosing people or to suggest that employers should start diagnosing their employees or even give you tips on how to do that. It's really about raising awareness of the kinds of things that might be in a workplace that we need to be thinking about a little more deeply in order to make the workplace successful for neurodivergent employees and applicants. So some examples of the types of conditions are on this slide. Autism spectrum disorder, which now includes Asperger's, attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, dyslexia, which is a condition impacting reading and word recognition, letter recognition. Dyscalculia relates to difficulties in number recognition, number usage, or math. Dyspraxia relates to difficulties in movement and balance. Obsessive compulsive disorder is uncontrollable or recurring thoughts or behaviors. Sensory processing disorder is oversensitivity to any kind of sensation. It can be sound, it can be smell. And then Tourette's is repetitive involuntary movements and vocalization. There are many more examples than this. One person may have one condition, they may have more than one condition. They may demonstrate it physically, they may not. And so we will also reiterate this point, there's no one-size-fits-all solution to addressing an employee based on the fact that they identify one diagnosis. We need to look at this individually with each employee. There there are misconceptions about many of these diagnoses. For example, obsessive compulsive disorder. People may think that that just relates to things like hand washing. That can be a huge range of things. And so we're going to identify some things to explore with employees and think about in advance of someone actually asking for an accommodation. Why are we talking about this now? We have several reasons that make this really critical and really important that we're being proactive now about addressing neurodivergent employees in our workplaces. We have a changing demographic makeup. I think many of us have had lots of discussions around generational issues and how that impacts a workplace. This can be compensation, this can be how employees receive feedback, what their goals are for work-life balance. And the changing demographic is also coming to the forefront in terms of requesting accommodations. In one survey, 42%, so nearly half of the employees in the Gen Z age group said that they had asked for an accommodation versus 27% millennials, 21% Gen X, and 13% boomers. So there's a huge difference in these age groups about just asking employers for an accommodation. Then there's also statistics that tell us something about employees who identify themselves as neurodivergent. In asking law students, 25% said yes, only 7% of practicing attorneys said yes. So there's a big difference even in that self-identification. Number two is the increased diagnosis and increased awareness, and I'm going to get into that in much more detail in the next slide. But the experiment of remote work during COVID allowed many employees to experiment really with working remotely and see how being out of a stimulating office environment might benefit them. For some people, it was no benefit at all, but for some neurodivergent employees, it was a huge benefit. And there's increasing discussion about remote work or other types of accommodations to mimic remote work that have come about as a result. And then we wouldn't be lawyers if we didn't talk about increasing legal challenges. The EEOC data from 2023, which is our most recent year that we have data, showed there were 488 just autism-related ADA charges, and that's compared to 53 just 10 years earlier. So there's a big increase in the awareness of legal remedies for dealing with these conditions for employees and applicants who have them. I mentioned the increased awareness, and this really deserves some special discussion. There are constantly developments in this area, and people are being diagnosed earlier, including when they're still in school. And so this is one reason why we're seeing this more with Gen Z workers. They have had a diagnosis probably longer and had experiences in school asking for accommodations and understanding what that process can look like. They have more of an expectation that that will be available to them in a workplace. They're much more likely to acknowledge that they have learning and thinking differences than older generations, whether that's just due to lack of awareness or their familiarity with the discussions around it. At the same time, we're getting increases in adult diagnosis. You've probably seen recently Bill Gates speculated that he thinks he might have had autism or have autism, and that's increasing in workplaces. I'm familiar with lawyers who have had late diagnosis of autism or ADHD or other conditions. They're not as used to knowing what accommodations they might need, and so they're asking for the first time and still learning what they might need. And then again, COVID-19 and the move to remote and even hybrid work has highlighted possibilities around accommodations, particularly for neurodivergent conditions that employees might not have been aware of. So there are many legal obligations that come from this. First and foremost, ADA and other anti-discrimination statutes. Neurodivergent conditions often, but don't always, meet the ADA definition of disability. So there clearly cannot be discrimination, but we're really going to focus a lot today on another obligation from the ADA, which is providing reasonable accommodations. Many examples of this, this can be work schedules, break time, noise canceling equipment, lighting, ways that work is provided or given feedback on. And as Erin is going to talk about in a minute, reasonable means accommodations that do not impose an undue hardship. So it's not anything an employee might ask for, but this might ask us to stretch our imaginations a bit to think about what might be available. And on top of all of that, we have confidentiality and sensitivity. We're talking about medical records often here, and thinking about protecting those, making sure that the information is kept to those only with the people that need to know. And counsel and HR should make sure that any exchange that we're having complies with any privacy regulations around it. With that, I will turn over to Erin.
Thanks, Teresa. So as Teresa alluded to, we're seeing a rise in challenges that are being filed related to folks who have or who identify as neurodivergent. And so we thought it would be helpful to, again, kind of talk through what the ADA does require. And it prohibits discrimination in various elements of employment, which includes both hiring, promotion, and retention. And it mandates that employers have to provide reasonable accommodations to qualified individuals with disabilities to ensure they perform their job duties effectively. And it also mandates that employers give all employees, disabled or not, access to all benefits and privileges of employment. And so what exactly does that mean? And to kind of break that down, it's important to kind of look at the critical terms that are used in the ADA. And so we start with disability. And so under the ADA, a disability is defined as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And that definition would include individuals who have a history of an impairment or are perceived as or regarded as having an impairment. And it also requires that for those individuals who have a disability, that they be granted a reasonable accommodation. And that is any change or adjustment to a job or a work environment that enables a qualified individual with a disability to perform the essential functions of the job. And that includes modifications to work schedules. Teresa alluded to noise canceling equipment or other equipment that deals with or tamps down some issues that that employee might be experiencing, or a change in the job duties, as long as it doesn't impose an undue hardship on the employer. And so what is an essential function? So it's those fundamental job duties of the position in question. And those are tasks that are considered critical to the job and really cannot be removed without fundamentally altering the position itself. And it is critical for an employer, honestly, not just in a reasonable accommodation setting, but really generally speaking, to know what those essential functions really are. It's kind of the beginning of hiring. It's ensuring classification is proper. And so it's really critical that the employer be able to easily state these are the essential functions of the position. And what is undue hardship? And so it refers to significant difficulty or expense incurred when an employer provides an accommodation. And the factors that courts consider when determining whether there is an undue hardship, that includes the nature and cost of the accommodation, the overall financial resources of the employer, and the impact of the accommodation on the operation of the business. It tends to be a pretty high standard, but again, it really is a very individualized focus. And so as we mentioned, it covers all aspects of employment. So that means that your obligations begin right when a person applies. So it begins at the time that a person applies to hire at your company and extends, through retention. And so for that reason, we want to think about, providing accommodations during the application and interview process, and starting to really think about, is this process really geared toward First, creating a welcoming environment, letting people know that they can be open and honest about limitations they might be experiencing, but also from a business perspective, is your interview process really identifying those individuals with the skill sets that best fit the position? I see a question, Teresa, do you see it as well, about a promotion that require a person who was put into a position that required travel as an essential function, who said they could not travel. If we have no vacant job for them, is it okay to let them go? I would say yes.
Yeah, I think we'll talk about what an interactive process might look like for this employee, because you probably, I mean, let's assume that you have gone through that process with them and discussed what might be available, what other accommodations there might be other than travel. We're going to accept, though, that travel really is an essential function of the job, that you're required to go meet with, say, a customer in person in order to facilitate this. And if they cannot travel, they're not able to meet the essential function of the job.
Agreed. All right. And so a person with a disability is a person who meets one or more of the following criteria: physical or mental impairment, and that is a person has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And those activities can include things such as walking, talking, seeing, hearing, learning, and then the real helpful, working. So it can be a fairly broad definition. And is regarded, has a record of such impairment. And again, it means even if the person isn't currently disabled, there's something in their past that's known to the employer, that they had a disability that substantially limited one or more major life activities, and then regarded as having an impairment. That's a person who others, specifically the employer, regards them as having an impairment. And it, again, can include a situation where the person has no disability, but for whatever reason, there is a belief by the employer that they are substantially limited in one or more major life activities. And so the ADA mandates that the definition of disability be construed broadly, and the EEOC has, of course, promulgated specific regulations that define and further delimit, when a person qualifies for ADA protections. But when you are dealing with an employee, it's really helpful to try to bear in mind that there is a broad definition, and that this inclusive kind of definition allows you, and you should be considering a wide range of conditions that might be covered. And you should kind of err on the side of providing protections to as many individuals as possible. And as Teresa mentioned earlier, ADA regulations talk about dyslexia, ADHD, specific learning disabilities. They list those as examples. Autism is listed within the definition of the ADA as something that will almost always be considered an impairment, a condition that qualifies for protection. But again, it's a spectrum, and that I think is really important to bear in mind as you are receiving accommodation requests, as you're receiving information from employees, that simply because they disclose a condition, you shouldn't automatically assume they need the reasonable accommodation or that they fit the definition of disability. But again, it's intended to be a dialogue, it's intended to be an open conversation, and it's just important to kind of, when you get these requests, when you get this information offered, whether it's offered to a manager, whether it's offered to HR, to really just kind of have this kind of open mind and bearing in mind what the regulations and the ADA say. So there is a definition there's kind of a listing under the ADA of certain mental impairments, again, that are kind of helpful to bear in mind: intellectual disabilities, organic brain syndrome, emotional or mental illnesses, so your anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, specific learning disabilities. I think Teresa listed some of those: dyslexia, dyscalculia, And the ADA also lists ADHD, and again provides like dyscalculia, dyslexia. So a reasonable accommodation. And that refers to any change or adjustment in both the application, hiring process, the job itself, the way the job is performed, or the work environment that enables a qualified person with a disability to perform the essential functions of the job. And again, an accommodation is considered reasonable if it does not create an undue hardship for the employer or somehow pose a direct threat to the health and safety of others. And so the goal is through the interactive process to really find a balance that allows the employee to perform their job effectively while still maintaining the operational integrity of the business. Some examples that we have talked through with our clients for folks who have or identify as neurodivergent include job restructuring, modifying job duties, reallocating certain more marginal tasks, part-time or adjusted work schedules to accommodate either medical appointments or allow for them maybe to come in the office later and just kind of shift that time period, reassignment to a vacant position for which the employee is qualified. I think Teresa mentioned that in response to the earlier question. Acquisition of equipment that might assist, such as for sensory issues, such as noise canceling headphones, other accommodations that allow kind of for the person to be able to perform their job effectively, setting up organizational systems, getting this person linked up with a job coach. Again, this is all really intended to be, interactive. One resource that I think is incredibly helpful, I'd be remiss not to mention it right up front, is the Job Accommodation Network. It is truly a treasure trove of information, giving a ton of great ideas. Now, again, you don't have to be affirmatively offering those ideas, but I think when a person comes in and says, here's a need, here's what I'd like, when you're starting that interactive process, kind of having access to these types of resources is invaluable because, again, I think they've really thought through various deficits and ways in which those deficits can be assisted to enable people to really, really perform their jobs well. The essential functions of the job. So again, what exactly does that mean? It means a person can be qualified by performing the essential functions of the job with or without an accommodation. So again, if you've got an employee who's blind, but you can provide text in Braille for them to be able to read, the text for that position, they're qualified to perform the functions of the position. And again, these are tasks that are fundamental to the role. Does the position exist to perform these essential functions? So a staff accountant who's putting in general ledgers, completing and compiling a general ledger, that is an essential function of that job. Are there other employees who are available to perform these duties? What kind of expertise and skill is required for this position? These are all things we're going to be looking at. And again, as you're hiring out for positions, it's always good practice to take a look at the job description. Ensure that you haven't done kind of this broad catch-all, strong communication skills, these kind of vagaries about, what you're looking for. Really talk to the manager and figure out, what is this position really doing? What are the skill sets that we're trying to capture in the interview process? And then as part of that, really consider whether your interview process is designed to capture that. We all have, or I should say I, tend to think of the interview process in a very traditional way that, folks come in, they sit down with a various group of people. We ask questions about their strengths and weaknesses and, maybe what kind of tree they'd like to be. And I do think that interview process does a fairly good job of identifying folks who would be, a good fit for litigation and employment. But that might not be the best way to capture a person who's performing a tech job, may not be the best way to identify a person who's going to be in an accounting position. So really think a little bit about whether your process is really getting you access to the folks who are going to be best suited to perform the functions of the position. And again, employers are not required to eliminate essential functions to accommodate a person. Ultimately, if they cannot perform the essential functions, the employee is not qualified. So again, if you've got a copywriting position where you need a person to be able to review and spot typographical errors and make grammar suggestions, that's not a position where you need to provide an accommodation to a person, who suffers with dyslexia and would not be able, even with a reasonable accommodation, to perform the job. So again, it's really important that, these things are done kind of on a case-by-case basis. Undue hardship. So again, we're looking at, significant difficulty and expense to the employer. So that is not something that would be disruptive to the business, that would fundamentally alter the nature of the business. Again, we are looking at the nature and cost of what is being requested, financial resources of the facility, the size and impact on the facility. So again, we've got a Google as opposed to, Sam's Bar and Grill, those are going to be kind of different tests. And we're going to be looking at, again, on a case-by-case basis. And what is the type of operation? If you've got an employee coming in and saying, I don't work well in kind of these open settings, do you have an available office? You're not required to go construct a new office. You're not required to go rent office space, but could you allow this person to work remotely? Do you really have the ability to fairly easily provide that accommodation, or again, talking through the interactive process? Flipping back to you, Ms. Spring.
Thanks. Because of the variety of ways that these conditions present, there is not a uniform solution where we can say, if an employee comes to you and says, I have dyslexia, these are the steps you should follow. There can be a huge variety of ways, just as there are a huge variety of employees in your workplace. And two individuals who have the same diagnosis may need a very different approach to an accommodation. And someone who has a diagnosis might not need any accommodation in the job that they hold. So it is important to remember that there is not a one-size-fits-all approach to handling accommodations, but it is an ongoing dialogue through the interactive process to understand, going back to our travel example that we got in the questions, if the person says, I'm not able to travel, and they have some documentation that supports that, you may have some back and forth with them about other examples of things, other things the job requires that they may or may not be able to do. Is there any way around the travel? Is there any way to limit the travel? Would that meet your needs? You may have a job that says it requires some travel, and as you get into a discussion with the employee, it may be totally fine to eliminate the travel. It really depends on whether that's an essential function for that role. So it's important to pause and think about, what can we do here for an individual position that might be different than what we did with the last person who asked this question. We have an issue too with many of these diagnoses being invisible. It requires more awareness on the part of the employer to think about how to address something in the workplace. And we'll go through some examples of issues that you might see. For example, problems meeting deadlines. It's good to pause there, and instead of just assuming the employee is not wanting to meet the deadline or is not organized, that maybe there is something behind it, and asking a question in the mode of, you're not meeting deadlines, is there something we can do to help, might open the door to something that is not a visible diagnosis. I see a question from ourselves. Says, are self-identifying individuals included in ADA coverage? Yes, if they have identified themselves as having a disability, and I see that they potentially lack resources. This is another place to get into the interactive process with them and talk about what they think they need and what information they do have to allow you to come to that conclusion. And I think that really hits on an important point, that these conditions are not always obvious, and employees, in fact, may try to mask and develop their own coping mechanisms in the workplace in order to blend in and not highlight a neurodivergent condition. There are stigmas around certain things that may lead employees to do that they don't want people to know that they are having struggles or challenges. Culture or organizational norms can impact that. Things that we think of as real positives in a business setting, like efficiency and productivity, may be very daunting to someone who has a problem with executive functioning. And they may not want to reveal that they have an inherent challenge in meeting that, even though there is a pathway to addressing that. So for employers, we need to be thinking about this from the beginning of the relationship, from the time that the interview and application process begins, all the way to the time we may part company with an employee. What are the issues that may come up along the way? And part of this is educating supervisors or managers to, about the kind of things to be looking for. Again, not to diagnose employees, because we don't want to have a disability claim arising from what might be good efforts, but to pause and think about, should I be asking my questions differently, or should I be approaching this employee with ways of trying to help without saying, I think you might need an accommodation. So anticipate some of these things in advance too. Some of the accommodations we'll talk about are things that can be controlled for before we get to the point of an individual, but give us more leverage in an employment setting. And then in-house counsel should be aware of these risks too if they're not being taken seriously. Erin had a note on the accommodations process. Yes.
One thing to just piggyback on what you just said about managers, I think it is critical for managers to be educated, as you said, trained to kind of spot instances where there may be a need for a further discussion. The other thing I do think is kind of important to also let managers know is that kind of granting informal requests for accommodation is really not a great idea, because it's not really done with the full kind of scope and awareness of what can be done for that particular employee. So what we see a lot are very well-meaning managers who will get a request and be like, absolutely, we can do this. We can accommodate a modified work schedule. We can do X, Y, and Z. And you kind of get down the road, and then there comes an issue because it wasn't flagged for HR. We don't have kind of that full interactive process ongoing. It's not fully documented. And so again, that is a great thing. You have a manager who is fully invested in their people, and they want to see their people get things done. But I think it's also really important to educate managers when these kind of requests come in, if they think that this could possibly be implicating the ADA, to really train them to get HR involved, so you're having that more holistic conversation, that ongoing conversation. One thing, and Teresa, I'm kind of want to get your thoughts on this as well. The diagnostic process can take time, and it's something where someone's coming to you and saying, hey, I have this immediate need. I think I can get my job done better if I had these accommodations. Once you kind of properly document that and start the interactive process, I often, unless it's going to be a huge issue, recommend that folks go ahead and implement that process. And then, kind of continue with diagnostic, identifying the appropriate provider. If you think, hey, look, we need a little bit more information about how this particular impairment is substantially limiting you, letting them know, look, we're going to put this in place. It's not going to be a permanent solution, but we're going to do this in the interim. As you kind of work through, what really works for the company, what is really kind of this tailored and bespoke accommodation. Because again, you can also implement a fix that ultimately ends up that you think in real time, okay, I think we can do this. We can have you coming in, an hour later and shifting, kind of your work hours. Well, after a month or so, that may actually be a problem because maybe they're missing customer calls, they're not able to get their job done. And so again, the interactive process is not intended to be, hey, look, we've come up with this solution through the interactive process and now it's set in stone. Again, it's this ongoing dialogue where we're continually revisiting, are we providing this accommodation and does this really make organizational sense? So I do think that, and I apologize, Teresa, I feel like I've really gone on a tangent.
No, this is great feedback.
But I do think that, a lot of the questions we're seeing have to do with folks who are really dealing with these issues in real time. And because they're dealing with these issues in real time, they need kind of immediate solutions. And so I don't think that there should be any hesitation to say, okay, look, we're gonna give you this accommodation now. And we're going to continue getting the necessary information in order to figure out, is this going to be a permanent fix? And I wouldn't hesitate to do that for your business needs. And I wouldn't hesitate to revisit an accommodation previously granted if it turns out it doesn't make organizational sense, or ultimately the medical documentation or the documentation for the identified provider doesn't support it.
Right. That's great. So I want to note one comment from one of our attendees who said a great example of neurodiversity. He highly recommends the French-produced series Astrid that can be found on PBS, which is great. And kind of feeds into this slide in terms of ways that neurodivergence may manifest at work. Again, we don't want your managers to be going around and going through a checklist of, okay, I've seen these things and I think this person probably has this condition. It is more of a red flag to employers to think about, if I see these things, this may trigger me to take a beat, to think a little more about how I'm going to engage with this employee about the things that I am seeing and steps that we may need to take in order to accommodate them. So I'll go through a couple of examples here, like communication differences. This is highly associated with autism, like challenges reading social cues, difficulties in verbal communication, or requests that things be written down instead of delivered in writing or orally. They can appear overly blunt or direct. Sarcasm can be a problem in a workplace because it is not literal. And so being aware of that kind of communication and thinking about how to make sure, one, that communication is done effectively, but also that we are receiving it appropriately and being sensitive to those issues is important. There may be issues with the organization and time management that I talked about a little bit ago. If you see those, what are we doing about that in order to follow up? This can be struggles with meeting deadlines, using standard schedules versus an alternate schedule like Erin talked about, or even prioritizing tasks in a way that aligns with how the business wants to prioritize tasks. Sensory difficulties can be anything from light to noise, certain fabrics. I've seen accommodations where employees have gotten different uniforms because the fabric of the usual company uniform is a sensory problem. Strong odors, certainly I'm sure people have done accommodations around perfumes and perfumed lotions and things in workplaces. That can be an issue too, beyond just allergies. There could be challenges with office structures. We found a lot of this coming back from COVID, that the open space planning that a lot of companies have gone to is now more challenging for exposure reasons, but is also a stimulus problem for some employees, or even glass office space where everything is visible. So this may be something to think about when you're doing your own office planning. Then the need for things like headphones, quiet workplaces, adjustable lighting, things that can help with sensory stimulation. Other ways neurodivergence can manifest include focus and concentration. An employee may be very, very focused on something they are very, very interested in, which is great, but it may mean that other parts of the job don't get the attention that they need. And then there can be fluctuating levels of productivity or attention during the day. The last one here on the slide is emotional regulation and stress response, that when things get busy or off a schedule that everyone had planned and expected, that the employee may withdraw or may have a visible response that other employees are not expecting. That would not be typical. Or they have a difficulty with adapting to a last-minute change or rapid changes in the task. I see a question here on the meeting deadlines would be considered an essential function. Yes, agreed. And so we're not saying don't make people meet their deadlines. Instead, it is thinking about ways to help them in order to meet the deadline. Having a conversation with them around, this document is going to be due at 5 o'clock on Friday. What do we need to do to allow you to do that? What are the steps in the workplace that need to be taken in order for you to meet that deadline, instead of just saying you don't need to meet the deadline? That's all we're suggesting.
Back to me?
Yes, back to you, Erin.
There was one other question that about a person who is self-identified, if the employer is permitted to ask for medical documentation as part of the ADA process. And the answer is yes. You are absolutely, as you would with any request for an accommodation, permitted to ask for information. Now, again, I want to kind of preface this by saying it is important that the information that you're requesting needs to be focused on, what is the impairment and how is it, substantially limiting. And so I'm curious to get Teresa's thoughts on this, but I really discourage my clients from ever using a standardized form, which is so unusual, right? I mean, usually lawyers are all about, standard, like uniform policies, but in this case, the problem with using a standardized form is that you can be asking for more information than you need. And you don't want to be doing that. Again, the guidance documents make clear that you should really just be asking for that information that is necessary for you to understand the nature of the impairment and, really the need for the modification. And once you kind of have that threshold level of information, you should be able to move forward. And really the type of condition identified will kind of also dictate where the appropriate support can come from. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a medical doctor. There's a kind of a host of other providers who might be able to supply that necessary information. And again, this is where if you've got a question about making this type of inquiry, reach out to your counsel. This is an area where folks really can unfortunately stub their toes inadvertently. And so again, if you have a question about, hey, I want more information on this, you really need to be kind of talking with someone and making sure that you're giving a really tailored request, that you're understanding the different sources that can really supply that documentation. Okay, so red flags and practical strategies. I am going to echo what Teresa has correctly emphasized. This is intended to be not a red flag to say, hey, we've got a person who has a disability. This is intended to be, this should be prompting, your manager should be looking for these types of issues to maybe prompt a larger conversation to ensure you're fully supporting your employees. And so if a manager is seeing things like a lot of requests for clarification or repetition of instructions following meetings, if you're getting feedback about unusual patterns about an employee, some communication issues, a person who might be struggling in meetings that, tend to be less formal. This might be a person who would benefit from a larger conversation, and just really allowing that conversation to be very open-ended about, what are the challenges we're seeing? We're getting, I'm seeing a lot of emails where you're needing to follow up. How can we do better? What are things that we can really put in place? And honestly, a lot of these strategies, which, maybe doing agendas before meetings, doing meeting recaps where, you're talking about the deliverables for, the coming week, setting out those deadlines really clearly. Those things are honestly things that generally, increase productivity for teams as a whole, really setting out your expectations as a manager. There's really no harm in that, and honestly, in general, people benefit from that. So there are things that can be put in place, for the team as a whole, not just for this person, that really allow these types of issues to be addressed fairly easily. But also, it's really important to make clear that people should feel comfortable coming forward, sharing some challenges they might be experiencing, sharing their condition, knowing that that's going to be kept confidential, knowing that you are trying to foster a workplace where everyone can thrive, where everyone can do their absolute best work. So again, being flexible about seating arrangements, coming up with kind of a clear method of communication, having standard operating procedures for the positions that allow those things to happen. And so again, like getting your managers really comfortable with receiving that type of feedback and really knowing how to address it. And if it's something where, hey, look, we're going to start having one-on-ones, we're going to start having recaps before every meeting, we're going to start, having agendas. Those are all things that we've seen to be very, very effective for folks that might have a different communication style. So we're saying, pitfalls. And it's just something to be aware of. This is absolutely something that we think is a timely topic. It's an issue where obviously, as folks are understanding, kind of limitations that they might have and getting those diagnoses, they are understandably coming forward and asking for accommodations. And if your workplace is a workplace that's not really educated on or able to understand the need for these types of accommodations, you could end up facing a charge from the EEOC. And just got some statistics here. There has been a significant uptick in the number of charges filed related to folks with autism. And generally speaking, these end up being, failure to accommodate cases. And of course, with the benefit of hindsight, you can read those and say, wow, if they just provided written instructions, or if there had been more of an interactive process, that really could have come out differently. And really where you really are coming back to is this is a matter of education. This is a matter of folks really not knowing how best to deal with a new condition that might just not be something that, they've been trained to flag and to bring to HR's attention. And so, again, if an employee is requesting an accommodation that is removing an essential job function, we give this example, providing a personal assistant to come in and, finalize reporting, courts are going to understand that employers, this is an undue hardship. This is not a reasonable accommodation. It's not hitting any of the necessary buttons. But again, we have this example from Subway. This was a case that was filed by the EEOC. A man was hired as a sandwich artist. His mother was very upfront and said, look, he's going to need training. He's going to need his instructions set out really specifically. He's going to need written instructions. And at least according to the complaint that was filed, none of those things were provided. And after his fourth shift, he was terminated. And there was a settlement of that. The Subway had to, or the particular franchise of Subway had to pay $30,000. And again, that seems like something we could really easily avoid if we're just, really training managers to look for these things, to understand the need for these accommodations. Because again, you can see a lot of productivity. You could get a really great employee who just needs kind of this extra, or should I say, different method of training. I see a question about a potential request for a consultant or non-employee who's working for them. So that really depends, I think, on a host of things. I mean, for certain jobs, it's definitely having a job coach or having a person who could come in kind of at the outset, kind of help set up organizational systems that enable that person to do, the job well, and to really kind of ensure that they're able to kind of function. That absolutely could be an appropriate accommodation. But again, what you have to come back to is this consultant, essentially performing an essential function of the job? I think that there are really it's kind of a case-by-case basis, like how expensive would this consultant be? Is this a job that's confidential? I think there are a lot of questions that you would need to ask before, you would say, oh, okay, this feels like an appropriate accommodation for this employee and for this position. But again, I've seen examples where it has been utilized. It's been utilized effectively, but again, it really is going to depend on how things shake out with that position, the size of the employer, operational, and obviously we can follow up if anyone has like more specific questions. And I think Teresa is going to grab one more question before I.
We have a question about asking the employee what their diagnosis is. All they said is they needed an accommodation. And we run into this a lot, not just with neurodiverse employees, but any kind of employee just coming in and saying, I need accommodation X for whatever reason. And that's not how the process works. Even telling you what a diagnosis is doesn't tell you what accommodation they need. So we're really talking to employees about what medical restrictions they have that prevent them from performing the essential functions of the job. So a way to deal with that is to give the employee their job description and say, thank you for bringing this to our attention. This is your job description. Please let your doctor have this and tell us what of these functions you are limited in performing and how. And that's what really triggers us accommodations discussion more than someone coming to you and saying, I need an accommodation and this is what it is. It's really dependent on what the restrictions are versus the essential functions.
All right. Do you want to go ahead and take this next? Do we want to address this next question, or should?
I think we should take that one. That has a lot of specifics.
Okay. Yeah.
We'll follow up on that one after.
Okay. Yeah. And honestly, as you can tell, this is a topic that Teresa and I both enjoy. And if we had the benefit of just being able to keep all of you here all day long, we would love to just like play this game. Because again, I think these questions are really fascinating. It shows like that folks are dealing with this in real time, and are looking for solutions. And there are solutions out there. Again, there are tons of great resources in addition to consulting legal counsel. And so, yes, we will follow up. So best practices. Educating and training your leaders, your managers, the folks who are going to be kind of seeing these issues in real time, potentially fielding requests, understanding that what their obligations would be under the ADA, and knowing how to spot a request for an accommodation. Because of course, as we all know, accommodation requests don't have to be made in a formal way. But of course, simply because someone identifies to their manager that they have a condition does not equate to an accommodation request, does not equate to them identifying themselves as, qualified under the ADA. And so again, kind of allowing that environment to exist, an open dialogue with employees and managers, and allowing those managers to really understand where intervention and further conversations are appropriate. And so engaging in a personalized interactive process. And again, I'm going to go back and just kind of hammer this. When your manager spots something that they think could potentially be an accommodation request, knowing that they need to know that they need to be looping in the HR business partner, that they need to be looping in HR, however that exists, so that when that process happens, it's done consistently, it's done with a full understanding of all of the legal rights that this employee is entitled to. And again, that it's done in a way that is that's uniform. And so it's funny because we talk about it being on a case-by-case basis, which it absolutely is, but this still needs to be documented. It still needs to be timely. It still needs to be fully interactive. So those are all things. When I say uniform, we really want all employees to have a uniform experience. It's one thing to tell an applicant or an employee hire, hey, we want you to make these kind of accommodation requests, but ultimately it is the deployment of those requests, it's handling those requests that really make the difference between employers who get sued and face a bunch of charges and employers who get employees, productive and happy. And so that's the fine line that we're trying to thread. Evaluating hiring and performance assessments. I think this is really kind of a fascinating area where really businesses can benefit from spotting folks who are great fits, who may not perform particularly well in a traditional interview setting, but might just knock it out of the park on the things that we actually need them to do. And so take a look at your job description, talk to your managers, get a sense from them, like, is this job description really capturing what you need? Like, who are the best candidates in this position, and what are their particular skill sets? Are we testing for that in the interview process? Are we, unintentionally doing like a culture fit, personality test in the interview? Are we just trying to find people who we like? Do we think from their resume they fit the bill, so we think all we need to do is kind of, make sure that we like sitting with him, we like talking with him? I don't know if anyone's experienced this, but a lot of times when people have particular experience on their resume, it may not really ultimately match up. Like, you may facially think this is a perfect fit, and they get in the job and they really can't do it. So think about, are there ways to really better test that? Are there ways to really see whether this position, which could be potentially objectively measured, are we really finding those folks?
We want to end with a really positive note in terms of neurodivergent employees. There are many, many ways that they can be successful at work. And so we are talking about accommodations, but there are so many positives that may result. And we want employers, your managers, to be open to considering the ways that neurodivergence can be an asset to your business in terms of innovation, deep focus, good problem-solving skills, and just really bringing a unique perspective to a workplace that might be more focused all in one way. Just bringing a different voice to the table can be very valuable. We have a few key takeaways. I think we've hit a lot of these in terms of the increased awareness and really thinking about the employment relationship holistically from the interview process forward. Even before the interview process, what do your job descriptions require, and are those accurate? taking these on a case-by-case basis is critical, and we should be proactive in training and educating. We have a resource list here at the end for you, and that'll be available in the slide deck. Also, if you grab that, we have a few questions we didn't get to, and we will follow up with those. But we thank everyone for joining us today and really enjoyed the discussion with all of you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.